Hello, welcome to this second edition of ASTC On Air. ASTC On Air is the opportunity of our organization to bring to our members worldwide insights, views and opinions about experts in important fields for us. So today we are with Tim Slingsby, who is the Senior Advisor for Public Engagement with the British Council. He is with us from his office in London near Trafalgar Square, I hear. So, Tim, welcome with us for the second edition of ASTC On Air. We really appreciate that. But before going into our conversation, please allow me to say a few words about a dear friend and inspirer that has passed last week. As many of you probably know, José Mariano Gago, the former Minister of Research of Portugal, passed last Friday. This was a unique example of a brilliant scientist who, throughout his career, has been thinking on how to bring the most complex science to the public in a way that they would understand and care about. And when he became a minister and he finally had the tools to do that, he really stepped up to the plate and he really translated what his vision was into reality by creating Ciencia Viva, the science festivals and all the activity that was related to that. And ultimately, the creation of 20 science centers in a country like Portugal. This is unseen before. It's going to be unmatched for a long time, and he will be very, very missed. I wanted to do this because of the importance of it, of him, but also because it's a very segue into the conversation that we're going to have today about public engagement. Public engagement was certainly his big theme. So this is a very important event that we wanted to mention, but there are other elements in the recent past that are showing how public engagement is really in the spotlights. Not so long ago, the Pew Center here in the US published a report that has been discussed a little bit over the last weeks, and that report showed that there is still a very strong support of the public for the scientists and for the work that they do, but there is a discrepancy between the way the public sees what the science is achieving and the way the scientist sees the achievements of science. And so we're going to have a look into that as well, because it really shows that there may be some kind of a problem in the relation between the public and the scientists. And so we will discuss that with Tim a little bit later on. And finally, another small element, the AAAS former director Alan Leshner is stepping down, and AAAS has decided to create an institute in his name, and it's an institute about public engagement with science. And the first topic that they will address is a global issue as climate change. So public engagement with science is central to science centers, but not only, and it's something that is everywhere at this point. So Tim, again, thanks for being with us. You are now the senior advisor, but can you tell us a little bit more about yourself? Where do you come from? How do you end up in your career having this position at the British Council?
Thanks, Walter, and thanks very much for asking me to be a part of this series as well. Yeah, I'm not a senior advisor yet, but thank you for the inadvertent promotion. I'm the British Council's advisor for public engagement in science, but my remit also includes STEM education as well. Once upon a time, I was a real scientist. I have a PhD in molecular genetics, and I was very lucky enough to work with Sir Alec Jeffreys, the very brilliant scientist behind the discovery of DNA fingerprints and the pioneering of the technique. And I suppose it was working with him initially that really opened my eyes to the importance of engaging the public scientific discoveries. And once I'd completed my PhD and a postdoc with Alec, I then went through a couple of roles in consultancy and in science enrichment type positions, and just felt very lucky to be in the right place at the right time to apply for this position at the British Council, where I have thoroughly enjoyed my work thus far.
So this question that intrigues me all the time, and so why is a scientist who is really an expert in a very narrow domain about science thinks that he should share that with the public, and how to do that when he decides to do it? So is that not something that is very difficult to, as a position as a scientist, to let people in his world where they basically don't have any knowledge about?
It's interesting that sort of matches with the thinking that I had as I was making the move from academia into the sort of more public arena. I think I was quite frustrated with knowing more and more about less and less. And from my point of view, I like to have conversations about science and the importance of science. And increasingly, a lot of funding bodies, particularly in the UK, do make demands of the PhD students, for example, that they should take time out of research during their study in order to spend some time in industry or in some sort of public arena. And also, of course, a lot of the funding of actual research proposals these days does include a remit for public engagement activities. And a lot of the thinking behind that in the UK is led by a very excellent chap called Paul Manners at the National Centre for the Coordination of Public Engagement. So there's an awful lot of good thinking going on in the UK and elsewhere in the world as well, of course, about how to close the gap between science and the public.
So, and how does that vision that you just described fits with the philosophy of the British Council about public engagement?
Well, the British Council, as many people know already, is the UK's National Cultural Relations Organisation. We exist to make links between the UK and other countries, and we have offices in over 100 countries around the world. So we're in a very privileged position as well, really. And the furthering of educational cooperation is really just one of our 5 charitable purposes. So, you know, I needn't list them all, but generally speaking, we promote cultural relationships between the UK and other countries. So we want to promote the understanding of different cultures as well. And education and science and technological development are hooks in which we might do that.
So I've read somewhere that the way you do that is by basing yourself on the achievements of the UK science and research. How do you explain that? Why is it important that the UK has a strong research community and a strong scientific production for the work that you do?
Well, it helps because one of our charitable purposes is to promote wider knowledge of the UK, and if there's something engaging and exciting happening in the UK, then that obviously helps one of the British Council's purposes as well. But I think to reflect on strengths in the UK, by a number of measures, the research sector in the UK is consistently towards the top in terms of international comparisons. Often it's second to the States. More often than not, it's second to the States, it has to be said. By some measures, by some indices, such as the field-weighted citation impact, we are number 1 amongst the G8 countries in terms of the quality of research that happens in the UK. But it's also important to make the point that the quality of research in the UK is only strong because of the international nature of the research that is based here. Mm-hmm. And of course we have strength in lots of other areas as well. For example, we have a fairly unique model of science education in which there's, I suppose there's there's not only a long history of it, but there's a long history of highly renowned professional STEM bodies such as the Institute of Physics, the Royal Society of Chemistry, the Royal Academy of Engineering. We have very strong teacher associations for science teaching, the Association of Science Educators, for example, and then national centres that provide networks of continual professional development for teachers. And then beyond that, there's all sorts of examples of really strong and world-leading science enrichment activities, informal science education activities as well. not least of which is an organisation called STEMnet, who across the UK have 30,000 STEM ambassadors available to go into schools at free for schools as well, to act as role models, to promote science careers, to promote science as something that school children should be interested in. And I think it's also worthy of mention, given that we are talking to you, Walter, that there are about 50 science centres and museums in the UK that collectively engage and inspire about 20 million visitors every single year. So there's a lot of good things going on.
So my question was also about the relations that you create internationally by building these programs. And so I had the thought that we hear more and more speak about science diplomacy. How is the action of the British Council in this regard of public engagement internationally different from a science diplomacy effort? Or
well, that's a good question. No, it's a nice question. And I suppose often that depends upon how science diplomacy is defined, but I think if we're going to create a different standpoint from the British Council, then our cultural relations work is about connecting people, whereas science diplomacy might be about connecting governments or connecting ministries. Now, our work, of course, might involve governments and ministries, but primarily it's about connecting people and promoting understanding between people.
So you basically create programs that are mutual beneficial between the UK and other countries, and you use the strengths of the internationally based UK research, I understand. Can you give some examples of partnerships that have been benefited from that work?
Yes, so there's a really great ongoing bilateral research program at the moment called BIRAX, which is it was the brainchild of the British Embassy in Israel as well as the British Council, and it allows for research collaborations between academics in Israel and academics in the UK in the field of regenerative medicine. So there have been, in the first call, about 7 different bilateral research collaborations were funded in the areas of Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, and heart disease as well, if I remember correctly. So it's a program that is enabling collaboration to tackle global health challenges, and I think it's a very powerful tool as well.
Okay, so it's clear that the British Council's work in science is important, and there's no doubt about that. And when you speak about it, and I've seen that in several documents, you don't speak necessarily about how science relates to society, but it's science for society that you use. And I know, and in Europe, this is something that is very common as well. So why would you focus on science for society?
I think there's a subtle difference between science for society and science and society. Oftentimes the terms might be interchangeable, but science for society seems to better represent science as part of culture, which is something that the British Council has always believed in our 81 years existence now. And so in its own way, even the use of that term, science for society, seems to better close the gap between research and the public. Also, a colleague of mine made the point recently that it also highlights the importance of participation in science and the democratization of science. So we worked in an EU-funded program recently called Nanopedia, in which it was a public engagement exercise that basically planted itself in public arenas, away from science centres and away from science museums in the main, and just asked the public their opinion on nanotechnology, without necessarily informing them or bombarding them with information. Just ask them their opinion, got them involved in the discussion. And then we had a tremendous program in Brazil as well, where the research collaborations were already in place. It was basically looking at land use and ecosystems. But the British Council provided some funding to bring the land users together with the researchers and engage them in how using the land can affect the very fragile ecosystems, and thereby get their buy-in into schemes and circumstances that make better use of the land in terms of ecosystems and the environment.
And so my interpretation of that is that is very close to what in the UK you have developed as a concept of what is upstream engagement, where the public is associated at the very beginning of the scientific research process by helping to frame the research question itself. Is that something that the British Council has sympathy for in your capacity?
Yes, I wouldn't hesitate to say, even though I just did hesitate, I wouldn't hesitate to suggest that it is important to involve the society at every level of scientific discussion. If that's framing the actual research question, then what that allows is for the public to influence the science that is going to impact on their lives and their environment. Of course, that shouldn't, it can't rather happen in every single case, because there has to be a degree of information sharing and a degree of education as well that perhaps isn't sufficient yet or can't ever be quite sufficient. But I think there's always an arena for public engagement.
So maybe at this point, you already gave some examples of things that you do, but are there in the public engagement arena in your portfolio a number of activities that you are performing that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, sure. I think we probably already work with a number of your members on the FameLab program. The FameLab program was the brainchild of Cheltenham Festivals, and we have an agreement with Cheltenham Festivals to deliver FameLab in every country that we can, to sum it up very, very simply. Apart from in the States, where we're very proud that NASA holds the agreement to deliver the FameLab program. Essentially, this is a program that identifies, mentors, and trains the next generation of science communicators. So we pick, we have the competition going in about 27 countries. When we first had the international program in 2007, there were only 9 countries involved. But it's Quentin Cooper, the great science communicator in the UK, is the compere of FameLab at the international final every year. And he likes to say that FameLab has grown faster than the World Cup. But it's a really great program that just gives mainly early career researchers the opportunity to stand up and speak about a piece of science that interests and fascinates them to a public audience. The catch being that they only have 3 minutes to talk about it. They're not allowed to use PowerPoint, and if they want to use props, they have to be able to carry them onto stage with them. And it's created all sorts of wonderful impact stories away from FameLab as well itself. Very simply, from a number of our FameLab champions delivering really brilliant TED Talks to establishing themselves as perhaps their country's first academically recognized science communicators as well. And then beyond FameLab, which by the way, the international final will be on June the 4th this year, live from Cheltenham Festivals. I encourage everybody to tune in. We have a number of great programs as well. I'll mention 2. One was a program very much led by the arts team of the British Council. It's a program called IceLab, which looks at the architecture of several Antarctic research stations, and used the beauty of the architecture and the different approaches to the architecture as a frame for the science that takes place at those research stations. And that's been really well received, and obviously there are a number of photographs within the exhibition as well that are really eye-opening. I think currently it's in New Zealand.
That's intriguing. Yeah, indeed.
It's a really
an approach that I've never heard before, so that's really nice. Yeah.
So I think currently it's in New Zealand. I can't recall how long it's there for, but it's coming back this way, and hopefully having some stopovers as well. Feel free to get in touch, anybody who wants more updates about that.
I will.
And then another one, we had a great collaboration really recently with our English business unit. There's an academic here called Roberto Trotta, and he wrote a tremendous book recently called The Edge of the Sky, all you need to know about everything there is. And he's an astrophysicist. He wrote this book about the mysteries of astrophysics and cosmology using only the 1,000 most common words of the English language.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a beautiful thing. It really is. It really captures a childlike wonder and curiosity about the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And we had an English Council lecture in which we used Roberto's book and a lecture from Roberto as the prelude, as the hook for a discussion about English as the lingua franca of science.
Mm. Yeah, I hope that some of our listeners will get inspired and try to find that, because it looks really, really intriguing. And we will give the reference to that for people who will ask us later. We will certainly.
Yeah, I can share all sorts of links with you, Walter. And I hope it's just a small example.
Listening to you, it looks that everything is fine and everything goes well, and we do a lot, and it's important that we do that, and we have so much effort, and it all leads to a better society. And then we look at the Pew results that I mentioned earlier, where obviously here in the US it seems that the public still supports very much the scientists and is very confident that they do great work, but that when it comes to results, they don't look at it in the same way as the scientists do, especially in terms of environmental issues, food and health. The negative opinions about the achievements of science are growing between 6 and 10%. So over the last 10 years. So all what we have been doing, the British Council and ASTC included, what did we do wrong? Why do we not have more impact on this?
That's a fair question, and I wonder whether or not it's looking at things from a skewed, self-interested perspective sometimes. I know an awful lot of public engagement people and science communicators struggle really to identify a metric or some way of measuring the impact that we're having. I think you know, considering that one of the results of the Pew study did show that public and scientists do agree that scientific innovation are deeply embedded in public life. I think that does show how important and how highly valued science is, and it aligns very nicely with a recent report, mainly in the UK, that was the Public Attitudes to Science survey, which showed that I think about 82% of respondents in the UK consider that science is an important part of our everyday lives. And I wonder whether or not the apparent growing gap in agreement between scientists and public that you just highlighted, Walter, and this is just a personal opinion now, is a result of the access to information that is so much more easy than it ever was before. And perhaps it's a very human attitude to take something like climate change, for example. In my opinion, it's a very human attitude to seek out things that just make us feel better, make us feel as though things aren't going to be so bad. So if there's one article that suggests that climate change is not an issue that we have to worry about, then people will grasp onto it, whereas 99% of articles will be suggesting that climate change is something to worry about and is something that requires.
And my question is it then not more important to communicate to the public about the scientific method and what scientific information means, rather than the information about the science itself?
That's a good question as well. I think there will always has to be a place for communicating about the science itself, and I think programs such as FameLab and institutions represented by ASTC are fundamentally important to that. Of course they are. The scientific method, I often wonder whether or not the scientific method is just a human method, and that's the message we have to get across. So perhaps there's no such thing as a science method. Perhaps it's just.
I tend to agree with you on that.
Yeah, it's just if somebody, back in Neolithic times, an elder grandmother in the caves happened to see that her young relative was poorly, she'd just try different things to see which would make that little person better, and that wouldn't ever be considered a
and some
scientific
people
one.
would
It's
even
just,
say that kids are born with the research method, with the curiosity that they have, and then they lose it when they go to school.
Yeah. Well, but we have programs at the British Council, for example, that seek to maintain that curiosity. And I know there's a determination amongst all sorts of public engagement institutions that really value that curiosity. The Royal Institution in the UK, for example, has a great new online series of videos called the RI channel, which really demonstrate the importance of family learning, for example, and really give some neat examples as to how that can happen. And in a development of our FameLab program was led by our team in Greece, School Lab. It gave all sorts of schools the opportunity for small teams to present a piece of science that they were interested in for 3 minutes. And the exposure that lots of schools got, especially in hard-to-reach communities in Greece, and the way that the science opened up the pupils and the parents' eyes to international opportunities as well, and the importance of science, it actually convinced a lot of parents in those hard-to-reach communities to allow, and this is an important point, I think, to allow their girls to stay in school, and thereby, in its own small way, encourage even more girls and females to stay in science careers, stay in science at higher educational science as a career choice. It's a really powerful example of how a low-cost program can have a really high impact.
And so this is interesting, because this whole domain of now we have more kids interested in science and they want to do science, and they get excited about it, and ASTC and British Council inspire them in that regard. But then the question comes, what for? Once you have that knowledge, what do you do with it? And the British Council seemed to have an orientation where the knowledge that you gather would be put into practice into addressing global issues for the planet. Can you say something more about that?
Yeah, sure. I suppose we create international connections, and it is hoped that those international connections ultimately start to address global challenges like climate change, like sustainable development, and health, of course, and access to clean water. I wonder whether or not those issues actually just, by opening up the research behind those issues to the public, I wonder if they just better highlight that they are not just scientific issues, they are societal issues. And science is just one branch of the solution to whatever those issues are. We had an event a couple of years ago, we were talking about this just briefly beforehand, that sort of brought together researchers and civil society with a view towards the upcoming post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think the more opportunities there are for scientists to speak to other audiences like civil society and the public to speak to scientists, the more clear the scientific approach will be, steering away from our mention of the scientific method, and the more clear the mutual benefit each of those communities can provide to each other will be. So, yeah, I think it just allows that interdisciplinary approach as well.
And I like that we ended here, because that combining the science and the societal aspects was actually the whole goal of this public engagement exercise, I guess. So Tim, thank you very much for this conversation. Maybe in a word, do you think that in the very near future there are opportunities for ASTC and the British Council to work together on this kind of issues?
I would certainly hope so. As I mentioned earlier on in our presentation, I think there are a number of your members that are already working with various British Council offices around the world on the FameLab program. And I know that there are others in a number of countries that work with us on a number of our science festivals, for example, as well, which have been set up co-partners with British Council and a number of science centres around the world and other institutions as well. So Yeah, I think wherever there's a circumstance in which the British Council's mission for connecting people worldwide and connecting people with the UK and really creating that high impact, wherever the wherever ASTC can help, wherever the British Council can help ASTC as well, I think that's something that we should certainly explore, and I'd really welcome any comments or questions or ideas from people who've been watching or people who happen to catch the recording.
Thank you again, Tim, and thanks for all the insight that you brought and for the lively conversation. Hopefully we meet very soon and continue that conversation in other locations. Thank you all.
I look forward to it, Walter. I think we could continue the conversation for a long time.
Next ASTC on Air in May. Thank you so much.